Welcome to this episode of Interview with the Authors. My name is Anna Wessel. I'm the admissions counselor for the Augustine Institute Graduate School of Theology, and I'm joined by Dr. Mark Giszczak, who is a professor of sacred scripture at the Augustine Institute. He earned his PhD from Catholic University of America, and he specializes in Old Testament wisdom literature, as well as biblical theology and Catholic biblical interpretation. All right, so he has authored a number of books, including Light on the Dark Passages of Scripture, The Wisdom of Solomon, a Catholic commentary on sacred scripture series, and the book we'll be talking about today, which is Suffering What Every Catholic Should Know. And it's published this year by the Augustine Institute and Ignatius Press. All right, without further ado, I would love to hear, Dr. Giszczak, why you decided to write this book and what was your motivation for it.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, in many ways it goes back a few years to a talk that I gave to some of the missionaries of charity sisters, the Sisters of Mother Teresa, about St. Paul and his theology of suffering. So St. Paul suffered a lot in his life, right? He was shipwrecked, he was stoned, he was persecuted, he was whipped, all sorts of terrible things happened to him. And he came to kind of associate his suffering with Christ and with his apostleship, right? His mission to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles. And so I was sharing that with the sisters and describing these different passages where he talks about his suffering, and it was very helpful to them. They hadn't heard this kind of theology before, and they work with a lot of people that are suffering a lot, right, with the poorest of the poor. And so that kind of inspired me to teach a class on the theology of suffering, which I did a few years ago in an intensive format here at the Augustine Institute. And that was just a really moving experience where, I had people fly in from around the country. We were together for 5 days talking about these issues all day long. And it really made me think, I really need to put this in writing. I need to find a way to convey these ideas in writing. So anyway, that led to the production of the book. And I think my conviction became that just a little bit of theological thinking about the topic of suffering really goes a long way in the spiritual life and intellectual life of the Christian. And coming to understand what the church teaches about suffering, what Scripture says about suffering, actually helps us to cope with it. Right? Reading my book won't take away all of your suffering. I wish I could do that, right? But it might help to understand it a little bit better and understand how to approach it as a Christian.
That's wonderful. Do you mind explaining how our sacrifices during Lent in particular are related to Christ?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different types of suffering, and I kind of go into categorizing them all in the book. So voluntary suffering, involuntary suffering, this kind of thing. And I feel like Lent is such an interesting time in the year. And it's one of the things I love about Catholicism, right? Where we have an opportunity to suffer on purpose, right? It's deliberate suffering. And in this way, you could relate it to these ideas like deliberate practice and the 10,000 hour rule. If you want to become an expert, you have to keep working on the things that are hard, But also something as simple as exercise, right? If you want to deadlift 600 pounds, you don't just walk into the gym and try to pick it up. Right. That's not going to work, right? You've got to work your way up to that over time and build the muscle necessary to accomplish that task. And I think Lent is an opportunity for us to do that with our soul. So one of the chapters in the book, I talk about how suffering tests us, right? It's like a trial, but it's not a trial of the mind or of your physical strength. It's a trial of the soul, a test of the soul. But how do we prepare for that test? We prepare for that test by doing little tests along the way. So this is why the church offers us these mortifications, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, right? Where I give up my time for God by prayer. I give up my food for God in fasting. I give up my money for God when I give alms. And we have other forms too, like vigil keeping, right? I give up my sleep for God. And by doing all of these little deliberate sufferings on purpose, these voluntary sufferings, I'm actually preparing my soul for the much bigger, inevitable sufferings that will, eventually come my way that I don't really have any control over. And if I haven't been doing those practices, then it's going to be really hard. It's going to be like walking into the gym and trying to deadlift 600 pounds or, moving a piano without having done, proper exercises beforehand. And when we engage in Lent well, right, and we do these little voluntary sufferings, these little practices of mortification, it prepares our soul for those bigger tests that will come our way.
That's great. That kind of recasts why I'm doing what I'm doing for Lent, and definitely makes me want to practice more to be ready for bigger suffering. Thank you for that. So I guess one question is, what is your favorite chapter of the book, and why?
Wow. That's hard to say. I mean, one of my favorite chapters is the book about the suffering of God. So one of the issues that arises when we think about suffering is, well, like, how does this relate to God? How does it relate to Jesus' suffering on the cross? And does God suffer, right? And so this is maybe the most unique chapter. I would say the most difficult chapter in the book to read, the most theological one. And it kind of gets into the weeds of theological debate of the 20th century. I'll try to summarize very briefly what it's about. Okay, so in ancient times, right, Christians got a lot of their ideas about God, not just from the Bible, but also from Greek philosophy. And one of those ideas that matches both in the Old Testament and in Greek philosophy is this idea that God doesn't change, right? That God is unchanging, that he's the unmoved mover in Aristotle, right? That he's impassible, that is unable to suffer. And so Christians kind of adopted that. It's in a lot of the early ecumenical councils, early theologians, and the church fathers kind of love that, where it's like this weird paradox where Jesus is the impassible yet passible, right? He's the one who suffers and yet can't suffer, right? Because he's both God and man. Well, in the 20th century, a lot of theologians who had experienced, like the horrors of the Holocaust and of other really terrible events in the 20th century, started to change their thinking about God and started to think, well, maybe when Jesus cries out from the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? That there really is some sort of like break between the Father and the Son, and that Jesus really does experience like abandonment by the Father, and that there's some sort of like rupture in the Trinity. Well, this really isn't Orthodox Christian theology. And so it's not a long argument in the book, but I kind of want us to go back to the traditional way of thinking about God as the one who's incapable of suffering, and that Jesus, yes, he suffers, but he suffers in his humanity, while his divinity is impassible and incapable of suffering. I think this is really important because I want to believe in a God who is bigger than my suffering. Right? If God can suffer, that means that he can be kind of like jerked around by the universe, right? That he can be changed, right? That he can be affected, and that there's something kind of bigger and more powerful than him, right? Whereas if God is impassible, as Christian teaching has always maintained, then he's actually bigger than my suffering and able to take it away.
That's super encouraging and good to know. I'm curious, so Jesus suffering in his humanity, does his union with God and his divinity lessen his suffering in his humanity at all?
Yeah, I mean, so this is complicated, right? It's a difficult thing to get our heads around, and it is paradoxical, right? Because he's fully God and fully man. So Jesus suffers, right? But it's according to his humanity, right? Not according to his divinity. So his divinity is not broken or ruptured or somehow diminished by the crucifixion, right? He maintains his identity, right, as the second person of the Holy Trinity, and his unity with the other persons throughout the entire event of Good Friday.
Wow. Okay, that's amazing. That's perfectly timed as Holy Week comes up here.
Yeah.
One more question. What is something unexpected that you found when researching and writing this book?
Yeah. I think one of the weirdest parts about thinking about suffering is how personal it is. Right? So there's a chapter in the book where I just talk about how suffering is very personal. In that way, it's very private, right? Where I can't fully communicate my suffering to you, and you can't fully communicate your suffering to me. There's this kind of incommunicability about suffering. And I feel like that's something that kind of surprised me, or that I didn't fully understand before I got into this, that I think is really important to keep in mind, So whether it's, when you're suffering yourself, or whether it's you're trying to comfort a friend who's in the midst of grief, that there's a way in which their suffering is kind of untouchable, right? Like you can't fully get it, And so I think it's dangerous for us to say to somebody who's in grief, to say something like, oh, I understand, right? Because you really kind of don't, right? There's a way in which you're kind of removed from the other person's suffering, and that they really have to experience it themselves and be changed by it. And in that way, yeah, I think suffering is very, very personal, but it doesn't mean that God can't get in there. You know what I mean? Like there's that kind of space in us where like only God can kind of minister to us, and other people really just aren't that helpful. And I feel like it's in this idea, right, that suffering is very personal and very private and incommunicable, and that we need to allow God into those spaces in our heart to receive the healing that we need.
Wow, thank you. Well, that is everything for today. So thank you everyone who is watching this interview. And if you'd like to purchase the book, we will put the link for it in the show notes. I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited to read my copy and maybe take your class at some point if it's offered. I could audit. And finally, thank you, Dr. Giszczak, for your time. This has been wonderful, and may God bless you in your pursuit of truth.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here.